Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists got it correct, and this is Tom Novolish, your host. We've got a lot to cover today, and what we are is finishing up with part 4 of Church and State Theological Polity, Muddle, and specifically in relationship to the sermon by Reverend President Ezra Stiles, whom I've talked about in the last program in part 3. Where we're going to focus today is on From Commerce to the Christian Republic. And before we really get into that, I do want to talk about a couple of things, but just to highlight that is that this, where we're going with commerce, boy, where we are today is nothing in comparison to the idea of how America would commerce from that foundational perspective. And then we're going to talk about that Christian Republic, and it's basically foundational. And I am going to give you a quote here from the Dr. Thornton, who actually did the compilation of the pulpits of the Revolution. And I think it'll be interesting in support of how we should be looking at this whole idea of a Christian republic, or as it's being called now, Christian nationalism. But Ezra Stiles talks about it very detailed. And we'll see where we can get into all of that. But first off, I need to open this program with a question that was brought to me from a listener and happens to be one of the board members for Samuel Adams Returns regarding the third segment of episode 429, which was the episode primarily with Robert Gargaz in relationship to small businesses. And then I went talking about and making actually the introduction for this series of programs, which is going to end next week with section 5, or part 5, I guess is what I should say. But in episode 429, the question came about is that I was talking about what we were doing, what we needed to look at on Christian nationalism, a Christian republic, and the idea that I said that what we need to have is a clear understanding of a foundational Reformation relationship with Christ and how that becomes extensible. What wasn't clear was the extensible. And what that means is not only do we need to have that clarity of understanding of foundational biblical principles, but also the foundational principles of self-government, constitutionalism, and our rights as qualified within the Declaration of Independence. So that was the part 2. I had mentioned the first as a numeric concept as to what we must know, what we must have, what we must look at. But in inferring a second, I actually did tie the second into what that is in constitutionalism. Now, as we pursue this idea, and in that pursuit of Christian nationalism, we've seen attacks on that from evangelicals, and we've had a strange attack by non-Christian people that think that they know what biblical Christianity and Reformation Christianity is all about. You'll see in the references, you can go to the references where there was this one woman, not going to mention her name, she went off about what Christian nationalism and Christians are all goofy and all of that. And there was a couple good responses by folks. And once again, Pastor Doug Wilson makes a good response on that as well. So all of that is in the references for you to consider. But what I would like to open this first segment with, before we delve into the commerce portion of what Ezra Stiles wrote in his sermon. Remember, his sermon was from 1783, and this was in relationship to the Articles of Confederation. So the nation was coming together under those Articles of Confederation. In 1876 is when Dr. Thornton compiled the pulpits of the Revolution. And in that, in his editor notes and preface, he states this. So for all of you who are ignorant of our history, of the truths of our history, of the truths of biblical history, of the truths of national history, this paragraph's really for you. Because when you look at the dates, this is 1876, even after the Civil War, if you have any concept of a timeline of what was going on in America. And sadly, very few Christians, Christian colleges, Christian seminaries, ever address this point. Being, Thornton writes, the true alliance between politics and religion is the lesson inculcated in the volume of sermons and apparent in its title, The Pulpit of the Revolution. It is the voice of the fathers of the Republic, enforced by their example. They invoked God in their civil assemblies, called upon their chosen teachers of religion for counsel from the Bible, and recognized its precepts as the law of their public conduct. The fathers did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly. They prepared for the struggle and went into battle not as soldiers of fortune, but like Cromwell and the soldiers of the Commonwealth, with the word of God in their hearts and trusting in him. This was the secret of that moral energy which sustained the Republic in its material weakness against superior numbers and discipline and all the power of England. To these sermons, the responses from the pulpit, the state affixed its imprimatur, and thus they were handed down to future generations with a twofold claim to respect. We don't have that anymore. Where do we have these political leaders really calling on biblical insight for decision making? What is the idea of biblical, scriptural, Reformation economics? Where is it when we have in relationship to the Republic? You see, therefore, in our founding era, Christian principled leaders prevailed. Now, at best, we have deist humanism prevailing, even with the evangelicals in politics, bureaucracies, the judiciary, and yes, in business, because we'll be talking about business. So I really wonder, how many pulpits are really full of deist masquerading as evangelicals. Worse, for the most part, modern pulpits are not even clouded. They're not even anywhere near a remote reflection of the comments by Dr. Thornton regarding the pulpits of the Revolution. What we have now are those in the pulpits that, and I'll speak from a mega pastor here in our area, which is, he has been in the head of controversies here lately over the last month. But he said from the pulpit, and this is why I look at what is the evangelical masquerading as, because when you have someone of that stature, leadership, and national and international renown as an evangelical going, never will he address an issue from the pulpit, but he'll go home and cry over the various issues. Well, when someone does that, they're either ignorant of what Dr. Thornton wrote, which most likely they are, they're pietist, or they're deist in seeing that God, oh, well, maybe they may believe in the Trinity, they may believe in what salvation is from that evangelical perspective, but then that only leaves one last thing. They're cowards. They're cowards to be willing to stand within the full context of the extensibility of the gospel in every aspect of life, as our founding fathers and founding pastors did. So let me take you to the opening comments that I have here, and you can go to samueladamsreturns.net and read the newsletter in full and get all the references there. So when we continue with the referred sermon, the PDF is there. You can find it. You can link to it. And starting on page 19, after detailing the economic value, growth, and abilities of the newly formed states, Reverend Stiles goes on to give great homage to George Washington and other foundational leaders, including Sam Adams. He even gives details on American inventions and inventors. Isn't that amazing? Now, Stiles goes on then to move into section 2 of the sermon, which we're going to talk about as well, probably more in the third segment. We'll get into this because we don't have time to get into everything. But he sets a presupposition for the best form of government. And here it is, towards that Christian nationalism that even is beneficial to secularists. The secular world benefits when Christians are in charge. He knows the unregenerated human heart and mind and what it is in governing. And he makes this statement, and I quote, "A general spirit reigns against the most liberal and generous establishment in religion, against the civil magistrates encouraging or having anything more to do about religion than to keep the civil peace among contending sets," as if that's all that is to be done for religion by the friends of Jesus. That's what you have with so many evangelical politicians out there, evangelical bureaucrats, evangelical businessmen. They're there. This is a timely description of the modern politician and the bureaucrats, as I said. Stiles goes on to express how most use of religion in the mechanism of government, which then holds true for this very hour of our elected. He goes on to say here, quote, "Politicians, indeed, usually consider religion only as it may affect and subvert civil purposes, and hence it is mighty indifferent to them what the state of religion be, provided they can ride in a whirlwind and direct the storm. Nothing is more common than to see them in every country making use of sects," that means the different denominations, "for their own ends, whom they in their hearts despise and ridicule with supreme contempt." We can dig into this with the last quote, and I have this last 30 seconds here, which I'm not going to be able to get to this quote. We'll pick it up in the second segment. But the idea is we're seeing that is that a lot of times the politicians deride everything, especially in relationship to Christianity. The bureaucrats, without question, do. And the judiciary is very difficult because they are forced towards the First Amendment. Sam Adams understood it all. So come on back in the second segment as we pick this up. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment. And just jumping right into it, let's finish up the quote that I had from the opening section. And in that, I wanted to dig in to your belief system from that last quote in relationship to where are you, especially if you're a political leader or bureaucrat, are you using what's going on with the Christian community just to make different effects for your purposes, or how to use it to subserve the civil purposes? And, what is it? Are you indifferent? What does it mean to you other than that? Are you a deist? Are you one that just takes and believes that, oh yeah, there's a God, but you do not believe that he is alive and active in every aspect of humanity? So let me finish off with this last quote here, and this is to finish off the opening comments. And it's kind of towards and for the general citizenry, and is how they're manipulated in so many different ways and fooled by soothsayers looking to have what they can only pretend to possess. This again goes to the evangelical politicians for the most part. And this is what Stiles says. There is a glory in thy disinterested benevolence, which the greatest character would purchase, if possible, at the expense of worlds, and which may excite indeed their emulation, but cannot be felt by the venal great, who think everything, even virtue and true glory, may be bought and sold, and trace our every action to motives terminating in self. I just wanted to mention what the definition, and there's a lot of definitions there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net in relationship to what is in the sermon. And there's a lot there that modern man doesn't understand the definitions as they were. And as you know, I always look at the definitions from none other than our great individual that put dictionaries together, Mr. Webster. So with that, let's look at this particular definition on deism. Is the doctrine or creed of a deist, the belief or system of religions, opinions of those who acknowledge the existence of God but deny revelation. Deism is the belief in natural religion only, or those truths in doctrine and practice which man is to discover by the light of reason, independent and exclusive of any revelation from God. Hence, deism implies infidelity or disbelief in the divine origin of scriptures. Now, what's important about that is that we can see all of that alive in all of the transes, all of the weirdness in various denominational thinking, as well as what we see in how those who govern react. And it's just the travesty of it all. So I wanted to go real quick in here and go through the ideas that we have from Dr. Stiles. And where he starts back is on talking about the commerce here in the United States back in page 19. And you'd think each of these pages was a chapter, I gotta tell you. But he goes through it, and this is very detailed as far as what he has in statistics. And he goes through on what the commerce between England only was in England and English America, And for 11 years preceding the hostilities, he goes through in detail how much was specific from the continental colonies and the West Indies. And then on the export perspective, then he looks on imports and how was that affected by virtue of the trade either directly with the colony or through the West Indies as far as exports were concerned, and then on the imports. And he goes through and he starts talking about the imbalances that there potentially were because of the way that the trade was looked at, in particular by Britain, then how our trade was cut back, and then what were the modes of commerce which the British merchants intended to have been universal. And what did they want, which became pushing our trade down, and then we weren't allowed to trade with other nations without everything going through England itself. So he looks at this all, and then he comes back, and when it's all digested, he says, look, this is a great opportunity right now for Great Britain to continue with trade through the American now states, and that the value proposition there is just phenomenal for England if they will take and have fair trade, if they will trade fairly and understand that we're going to trade with other nations as well. Now, when he talks about open trade to all the world, what he sees is that the growth rate for American trade is going to be massive, just massive. He goes through and he begins to talk about what would happen with that direct trade in Europe. He was looking at the justice and reciprocity of interests and where that was going to go, and how, once again, as I talked about last time, the nation itself was going to grow. And then he looks at the specific benefits for every community that's transfused with the motives of universal industry. And he asked the question, what's going to take the top? Is it going to be the industrial side of things, or is it going to be that in agriculture? And his view at the time was that both will grow effectively if they're allowed to grow according to natural effects, meaning how they would each go for trade and not be influenced negatively by government, which is what we saw, and one of the reasons why we fought the revolution and broke away from England. Now, he also takes and he looks about the political aspects of it, and that the politicians are going to want to get in there and become involved in the trade. And then so at the end of it, he says is that another thing that's tending to the public welfare is removing causes of political animosities and civil dissension, promoting harmony and strengthening the union among the several parts of this extended community. He quotes from Rome on how something that they did with that, but the idea is that we have to grow together. We have to find all our various attachments so that we would be vigorous and strong as a nation. Whereas when Britain forced us in other effects that violated, it caused violence, it caused dissension, and we needed to come together as a nation. We have a lot of that going on right now. We see that, and most of what we see is the shutting down of all of our natural mechanisms of industry and agriculture. It's being taken over by globalists, no different than what England was doing to the colonies. This is where history is absolutely important to understand, is that once again, and you're hearing it through all sorts of other political speakers out there or talk show hosts or whomever, is that we are at that 1773 moment and that 1776 moment where we need to declare our independence from the internationalist. They've woven so much in and taken so many of our liberties away that we're seeing, especially with this greeny weeny stuff, environmentalism, sustainability is destroying not only our industry, but is destroying our farming. And we're seeing that in Europe, they're finally standing up against all of the greeny weeny sustainability stuff, and the farmers are taking action. We haven't done that here. Instead, we're seeing chicken farms and factories being destroyed. We're seeing our crops being destroyed. We're seeing so much that our food supply is being destroyed that Bill Gates and now several of the major food manufacturers want you to eat bugs. They want you to eat bugs instead of what God gave us as intended food. Our intended food is the plants that we grow, the fruit on the vine and the trees, and yes, the animals that are there available for meat and all of the byproducts that come from all that is there in our food supply. So the intentions right now are no different than it was prior to the American Civil War. And then he makes that plea. He talks about England, how wonderful the relationship was. Then you threw it all away. And then he brings together, and Thornton brings together, of all the communities, all the countries known in history, that North American Republic, the North American Republic, is most conspicuously marked by the fusion, or rather the absence of rank and social distinctions, by community of interest, by incessant and all-pervading intercommunication, by the universal diffusion of education, real education, and the abundant facilities of access not only to the periodical conduits, but to the permanent reservoirs of knowledge. Now, the permanent reservoir of knowledge, being the universities, are cesspools of division. Cesspools of division. Well, there's so much more that we can go through on how every political administration, the appointment to offices, will never be considerably influenced by the sinister, private, personal motives, either of interests or friends. Yet, the safety of the state requires that this should not go too far. Now, we know that in every political administration, how you appoint the officers will ever be considerably influenced by sinister, private, personal motives of both the interested or the friendly. That's what now we have nothing but lobbyists that are making every aspect. And he warned against the lobbyist in that regard. And he talked about what we need to do to put a stop to that, and that is to have the moral leaders, to understand that. Well, he talks about returning to the cultivation of literature will greatly promote the public welfare. Isn't that interesting? In every community, while provision is made that all should be taught to read scriptures, which we don't do anymore, and the very useful parts of common education, a good proportion should be carried through the higher branches of literature. Well, first off, you can't get to the higher branches of literature because of all the garbage on the internet. And in addition to that, we don't even teach people to read scripture anymore. We're going to have to come back to the last section as we really delve into the Christian nationalism or the Christian Republic. So come on back with Sam Adams returns. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. And for those that do not get the second segment, I would ask you to go back to samueladamsreturns.net and either listen to the whole podcast or the videos, which are linked there, or at least go to the second segment in relationship to what Dr. Stiles was talking about in Commerce during that the colonial period and up through and into the Revolution. In addition to that, you can find a link there to the whole sermon at samueladamsreturns.net. Now, as we move into this idea of Christian nationalism or the Christian Republic, he takes and he writes from this very interesting perspective, and he goes through and he talks about even Poland, he talks about Germany, he talks about Russia, and some of the other Asian and European types of governments and republics in particular, and defines the issues that were there. And he goes on to say that liberty, civil and religious, has sweet and attractive charms, and that the enjoyment of these with property. Now you have to understand that's a key element that necessarily was not in these other republics that he's referring to. With property has filled the English settlers in America with a most amazing spirit, which has operated and still will operate with great energy. Never before has the experiment been so effectually tried of every man's reaping the fruits of his labor and feeling his share in the aggregate system of power. Never before, except in America, does that happen. And that's because individuals can have property. And the establishment of those individual rights and the understanding of who we are as sovereign citizens. He goes on to say this, that the ancient republics did not stand on the people at large, and therefore no example or precedent can be taken from them. This is the uniqueness of America that is being destroyed, especially in this present administration. And it started all the way with the Obama abomination. It started with the Clinton abomination. It started all the way back to FDR abomination. Or we can even go back a little bit further than that. We can go back to 1912, 1914. Excuse me. Nowhere in the ancient republics do we have civil and religious liberty with property, and that the republic stands on the people, not the ruling class. But that's what we're seeing now. It's the ruling class that has the power. The ruling class here in America are the ones that are of arbitrary principles, arbitrary power. So he goes on to say this, that even men of arbitrary principles will be obliged, if they would figure in these states, to assume the patriot so long that they will at length become charmed with the sweets of liberty. We have so much to learn here, and so much that he looks at in these pages in relationship to the vision, the growth, and what is going on at the time of the formation of this republic through that great American Revolution. So there's much there between page 23 and where we're going to move into section number 2. As he talks about, just real quickly, is that we have to look at the unity of the nation. And it has to come from God. It has to come from the pulpits. It is God who so ordered the balancing interest of nations as to produce an irresistible motive in the European maritime powers to take our side during the revolution, and how to win it, to end it, and how it was divine providence that caused us to come into fruition. So as we finish up in here, he has a nice little poem that he quotes from, and then we have to move quickly through many pages as he gives honor to Sam Adams, to especially a lot of honor to George Washington, a lot. He names a number of different people. He talks about the men and that their names would live on in all ages, and he lists them by state. And then he presses on into the second section all the way about, I have to get through here because there's a lot in where he is on his whole second point on the Christian Republic. But he goes through a lot of history here as well. So point 2, in showing that how the states have come into what he is saying now the great glory of the American empire. Point number 2 in the sermon is that her system of dominion must receive its finishing from religion, or that from the diffusion of virtue among the people of any community would arise their greatest secular happiness, all which will terminate in this conclusion that holiness ought to be the end of all civil government. Instead, now in our modern day, instead of holiness being the end of civil government, we have perversion, we have destruction, we have hate, we have division. This all begins on page 46 of the sermon, and I highly recommend that you delve into it because I have nowhere the amount of time to do anything other than highlights. So here, the political effort of the present day, being then through most of the United States, is to disunite, divide, separate them through fear lest the United States, like the 5 viceroyships of New Spain, should be entangled and oppressed with the spiritual domination of European and Asiatic hierarchies. Wow. How much can we stop right there and look at what's going on as internationalists, globalists? Once again, I have to say, I stutter at that in that I have to say there's nothing new under the sun. What we have going on happened before, and to take and stand against it requires that we have strong pulpits. It requires that the virtue that we would look at is not deistic, as deism would look at virtue. We have to have an understanding of Christian virtue and values and stand up for them. He talks about how Aaron is spurned at a distance. The Levites, the ministers and pastors, are beheld with shy contempt as a useless, burdensome, dangerous tribe, and in some of the states, for the only sin of being priest of the Most High God, they are inhibited all of civil offices, and to a great degree disenfranchised of their civil immunities and rights of citizenship. Okay, this is when we're seeing right now that is happening. And he looked at this from the historical ancient Hebrew perspective and what was going on during the revolutionary period. And then again, is that what is it that God wants? And he wants to be civil peace, but he is taking and saying here is that a general spirit reigns against the most liberal and generous establishments in religion, against the civil magistrates encouraging or having anything more to do about religion than to keep the civil peace among contending sets. We said that before. He says it again, as if this is all that was to be done for religion by the friend of Jesus. I put that in for you there in the newsletter at SamuelAdamsReturns.net. And then he goes through what does it all mean and how do we take and we bring it back to where our founding fathers had it and intended. And that's up to you, pastors. That's up to you, church leaders. What are you doing in understanding the full implementation of the scriptures in every aspect of the lives of your people? And then if you're interacting with politicians at any level, local, county, state, or federal, including the judiciary, you need to bring them into this perspective of understanding what it means for them personally as they need to bow every aspect of what they do for the public good under the sovereignty of Christ. So he goes through, he talks more, he gives you more biblical foundational references. He looks at what was neglected. He looks at what we should be adhering to. He looks at the policies that were occurring even under Hutchinson at the time of the foundation, at the time of what was going on in New England, and Hutchinson being the governor at that point of the Massachusetts colonies and New England in general. He says this, which was interesting to me: wherever religion is erected on the ruins of civil government, and when civil government is built on the ruins of religion, both are so far essentially wrong. You can't do that. So when he's looking at the church, has never been any political determinant here. And how it was vested and what it involved in civil or secular power in New England in particular. He goes on that a motive was that religion, the primary one, with our ancestors in coming hither and settling this land. That's what it was, religion being the primary one. It was not so much their design to establish religion for the benefit of the state as civil government for the benefit of religion, and as subservient and even necessary towards the peaceable enjoyment and unmolested exercise of religion. Of that religion for which they fled to these ends of the earth. That's what we don't understand, and that's what many of the pulpits, the generalized evangelicals, don't understand, is that statement right there. And there's so much more that I could talk to you about, and we're about 8 pages from finishing the sermon here, but that concept alone right there is that civil government is for the benefit of religion and is subservient and even necessary towards the peaceable enjoyment and unmolested exercise of religion. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a conference in Texas this weekend talking about Christian nationalism. I'd encourage you to look into the link at SamuelAdamsReturns.net to find a link to that conference. And I hope that you'll follow through and that Sam Adams will return again.